Hello, everyone. Welcome to Pidgin Palace Chat number 2, where we're talking about privacy and security on the internet, your data, mutual aid, how we can help other people who have lesser security consciousness than we do, but more security needs. And to start us out, we're gonna have Max tell us a little bit about your treatise.
Okay, all right. Hey, what's up, y'all? My name is Mylkweed. Can you hear me okay over there?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay, great. Just double checking.
Mylkweed,
So the thing that we're talking about today, the title of this stream is Privacy as Mutual Aid, which is something that I don't know if I want to claim that is a concept that I thought up, but I haven't seen it anywhere, and I wrote some stuff about it online last year when I think there was I saw that there was an increased need for digital privacy as people were, doing direct action and a lot of protest, and people still are, but so yeah, I mean, I am not a security expert. I'm an artist. I just am really interested in security and privacy. So I just want to start with that disclaimer. I'm also not a lawyer, so I recommend that you talk to one if you are doing something which could land you in serious trouble, and don't listen to me. But so I think that the idea of privacy as mutual aid kind of came to me because I was thinking about how most of the surveillance that's going on by the state or other people who are interested in surveillance in the past has always been direct surveillance, right? So you have to do something to make yourself a target of surveillance, or at least that's how it was, up until maybe the last 10 years. The feds are not wiretapping people that they don't have an interest in wiretapping. But obviously we know sort of since the Snowden leaks that it's a pretty different world now. But specifically, I think the thing that I'm interested in is how people who don't think they're doing anything wrong don't pay attention to privacy and surveillance, and thereby sort of endanger people who also probably aren't doing anything wrong but might have an identity that makes them subject to the state or state surveillance. So I don't know if that's too abstract of a way to start, but basically the idea that I kind of had was that as we started talking about mutual aid in terms of food systems and kind of helping people get groceries and that kind of stuff, we also maybe should have a conversation about mutual aid in terms of privacy and in terms of how from each according to their ability to each according to their need, right? So you may not have a need for privacy, but your disregard for it might endanger someone that does have a need for privacy. So I mean, that's the kind of fundamental concept. I think I was looking at a lot of court cases and people's experiences with activists, specifically experience with the government surveillance. And I kind of came to the conclusion that most of the data that they're using now to surveil activists specifically is data that's acquired by what's called OSINT, which means open source intelligence. So essentially it's data that, people are willingly putting on the internet, sometimes unknowingly, right? Like your information you give to a company might get leaked or something and you're not aware of it, but generally it's information that doesn't require a search warrant. It doesn't require, asking a company to comply with the law. It's readily available, so the government could use it or someone else could use it potentially if they know where to look. And the bad thing about OSINT, right, is that it's available, like I said, without any search warrant. They could find out a lot of information, where you live, who you associate with, what kinds of media you're consuming without any kind of warrant. But the good thing about it is that we're pretty in control of it in terms of, it's information that we've willingly put online or that we can control, at least, that's been exfiltrated from us.
Yeah, so all this information that's readily available, a lot of times they tell us that it's anonymously taken and that it's not linked to our names. But there are a lot of ways that they can take this anonymous content and find out who we are. Right, Mylkweed?
Right, yeah, totally. I mean, I think that it's the idea of anonymized data. So, well, okay, I guess I'll start by saying this, which is that, we know we have the term greenwashing, right? To talk about the way that companies sell us environmental friendly products that aren't really environmental friendly, but they're, quote, greenwashed, meaning that they're portrayed as environmental friendly. The same thing absolutely happens with privacy. So companies love using words like encrypted, anonymized, that kind of stuff, which ultimately sort of doesn't really mean anything. I mean, there's no regulation of those terms. So like Google and Apple will tell you that the data from your phone is anonymized, and people love hearing that. But the reality is that a lot of security researchers have found that it's like really pretty easy to de-anonymize that data. And you can bet that if independent security researchers can do it, then people that have motive to do it absolutely can, and people that have resources to do it absolutely can.
Give us an example of how they might de-anonymize the data.
Well, so I think the thing is that a lot of, anonymized data sets are originally, used for research purposes, right? So like if a marketing company wants to look at analytics data, right? Or even a small company. I've looked at this stuff for my own social media presence. They can look at the demographics of the people that follow them on a social media platform, which might be relatively harmless information, but it seems relatively harmless, right? It might be like anonymized gender, age, or zip code location of the person's IP address. But realistically, we've known for like 30 years. I think there was a 1990 study at Carnegie Mellon that showed that with those three pieces of information, your zip code, your age, and I think your gender identifier, like 87% of people could be identified. And I don't fully understand how the researchers did that identification. That doesn't seem like enough information to me, but I think that's the way that these companies get away with it. Is it doesn't seem possible, and really they have a lot more information than just your age and location.
Right, as I understand it, they can kind of triangulate the data.
Yeah, exactly.
And if they have a few points, they can fill in the blanks, maybe by knowing your location and that you like, tangerines. And
yeah, I think
if tangerines
that sounds
are
like
sold in your location, then they can somehow identify more of who you are, and pretty soon they've got everything there is to know.
Can people who don't have any form of social media or say don't use a cell phone, I think there's still also, that person will have a profile that exists because the relation to other people, there'll be a data point, like this person has a son and this person's bought gifts for this person, which I find pretty disturbing, as far as your own trying to cut yourself out of those data points. There's still going to be kind of that gaping hole of where you should be, they know about, and they have quantified, information for.
Yeah, I think probably 5 or more years ago, I read a thing about Facebook's sort of ghost profiles that they make for people who are either in photos or mentioned a lot by multiple people. That's exactly that, where they sort of, build a profile on what your behavior is. And like you said too, it's totally tied to purchases as well. Unless you are like a total, paranoid person, which maybe you should be, and you use a debit card. I use a debit card. My bank is definitely keeping track of all that information and probably selling it to data brokers, especially if you use a credit card, right? Like credit bureaus have so much information about your purchase decisions and, that could probably be triangulated to determine who you're with, if they're also purchasing something, and where you travel to. Absolutely. I mean, if just by gas stations that people fill up on alone, I'm sure you could find out lots of information.
And
But
that's why I feel like when people are asking, oh, is my phone listening to me? Like, they don't have to. They already know all these things about you.
right, absolutely. I mean, there's probably a way more complex data set available than they could even get by listening to you.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah, I think also the idea, Patrick, what you brought up about other people's decisions sort of creating a profile about you is something I think about a lot. And it's exactly the kind of idea that is challenged by privacy as mutual aid, right? So I think people who have never, for example, been arrested or dealt with the police might not think about their image as worth anything, right? But people who've seen a mugshot of themselves might think about their image as something they need to protect. And I think the fact that somebody could take a photo that I'm in the background of, and then, I'd become placed on a map at a certain place at a certain time because they wanted to post, their vacation or whatever, is like pretty unnerving to me. And I don't really think, obviously, I don't think it's realistic that we'll get to any kind of level of privacy consciousness or, what I would call like digital consent, where people are going to ask people who are in the background of their photos. But I can hope that would happen.
Yeah. So getting back to some of the original ideas about protecting people around you or the activists around you, what are some basic things that we can do?
I think the main thing for me would be that idea of of asking people consent before you share personally identifying information. So that's an acronym that if you get into privacy or if you're into it already, you'll come across all the time, is PII, which is personally identifying information. So pretty self-explanatory, anything that could identify a person, but it's an important thing to keep track of. So I think that's a big thing, is if you are going to, if someone asks, hey, can I have that person's phone number? Ask the person before you share the phone number. Like, that's a pretty simple thing to do. And same goes for photos and whatever else, right? But I don't think that's something we think about a lot. But I think it's, especially if you're hanging out with activists, it's something we should be thinking about. But also, I think there's argument that even if you're not an activist or a dissident or whatever, a lot of privacy advocates argue that there's no way to really know if something you're doing is breaking a law because we have so many laws. So it's probably smart not to, endanger yourself, regardless of if you think you should be visible on the internet or not.
What I've always tried to do, maybe for the last, 5 years, I got rid of my Facebook account. And that's a lot of what the Bring Foundation is about. Showing people the dangers of their social medias.
Right.
And Facebook being the most egregious, case of harm. But what I've always liked to do is whenever I get the chance to enter some information about myself, I give slightly different information. Mm-hmm. So that, in some cases I'm 72 years old, in some cases I'm 59 years old. I change my birth date whenever I can, just to put more information out there. I think that if we can encourage people to increase the amount of useless information about themselves, it might have a real positive effect.
Right, yeah, I think disinformation is a really good strategy. I know, Patrick, you and I have talked a lot about disinformation or misinformation.
Yeah, like noise. There's like signal the information and creating noise that distorts that. I'm all about that. I sometimes doubt the efficacy of doing that. That like I'm being sneaky, putting in like different phone numbers, but like they obviously know who I am. But I wonder the most efficient ways to put false information out there to kind of create too much to sift for.
They know who you are, but they don't know necessarily if they're, if suddenly they're paying attention to you.
Yeah.
Then they have to sift through some things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I might
that's
think. Yeah.
I think it is efficient. Also, I think something that's been proven pretty efficient in terms of entering wrong information, and this is not so much, I guess, personally identifying information, but if you, for example, decide you want to get rid of all of your Facebook posts, or, I mean, I don't know if this works on Facebook anymore, but at least on Reddit it would work. It's a lot of people advise that you would change the information in the post before you delete it. So that way the most recent version is stored on whatever server the post is stored on. And obviously there's no telling really if all the versions are stored, but typically if something's being archived and backed up, if you alter it and then delete it, it'll save the altered version. So that's one thing that I think has been tested, and I mean, I'm not sure if it works across all platforms, but
That's a really great idea. One thing I noticed in some of your writings was this idea of having 2 phone numbers or 3 email accounts, and to try to like compartmentalize different aspects of yourself and your communications, increasing increasing the chances that it'll be harder to, I don't know, take down your activist friend.
yeah, compartmentalizing, I think, even without acknowledging or like speaking to people who are subject to, state surveillance or any other surveillance, I think compartmentalization is super important because of the prevalence of data breaches, right, and leaks. So I mean, this is probably not new to most people now, but it may still be, and it's super important. If you are using the same password and email combination on multiple accounts, all it takes is one of those sites being breached, and I can go and look at the breach data with minimal effort. I mean, it's usually publicly available, that's why it's a breach. And then I can just, formulaically try to plug that information, your email and password from that one breach, into all your other accounts. And if that's the email and password for a service you never pay attention to, maybe you like signed up for Last.fm in 2011 and never look at that and aren't aware of the breach, but it's also the password for your bank account, I can go and empty your bank account with literally no hacking ability, no knowledge of, any kind of private information about you, just what's been exposed in data breaches. So I definitely recommend, just at the very minimum, using a different password for every single account you have. And obviously you would want to use a password manager, because the point is that you shouldn't be able to remember that many different passwords and the complexity that's usually necessary. And that's something I would recommend for everybody, even if you are not at risk and you don't know anyone and you don't talk to anyone. I think that's something that people should do. But the thing about compartmentalizing phone numbers and emails outside of accounts is super important too, because like you said, it's kind of like the people, you don't know who you're really, if you share your email address with one person and it's a personal email address you use for personal things, you share it with somebody that's a work contact, you don't really know who they are, you don't know them that well, you don't really know what hands that information is ending up in, and there's quite a bit of damage that can be done with something like an email or a phone number. So yeah, I mean, I think it's always advisable. I definitely recommend Anonaddy is a great service. It's ANONADDY, and they have a free option that you can sign up with and make basically unlimited alias email addresses to use for different accounts and various things.
What about just a straight password manager like LastPass?
LastPass is pretty good. I am a little paranoid, and so I don't like to use anything that is connected to the cloud or that syncs across devices. So I personally like to use KeePass XC, but with KeePass you'd have to manually, put the database on your phone and put the database on your computer.
So you carry the database, is that the difference?
Yeah, exactly. So it never is on the internet anywhere. But LastPass is great, and I will say, if it's LastPass or nothing, absolutely use LastPass. LastPass is really widely recommended by a lot of people. I just, like I said, I'm a little over paranoid, but I always recommend, I mean, it's the same thing I always recommend whatever you can do, whatever you are. If you don't do anything, it's not going to work. If you use LastPass, it's going to work better than doing nothing, like significantly better.
What made you so paranoid?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, just being a person who has been kind of, I don't know how I would say, like involved in various extra-legal activities sort of since I was a really young kid, and having, close people in my life who've had really serious consequences of making mistakes with their privacy. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but I'm trying to be intentionally vague.
Yeah. Okay, let's hear from Molly.
I'm definitely more interested in the impacts of, I think, data and what can happen if it gets into the wrong hands, but also what can happen when it gets into the hands that's been designed to be in, and the entire system of advertising and security, national security, and all these things that are constantly keeping track of everybody. And Max, you had mentioned earlier kind of protecting your image and how people may or may not even think about that as something that needs to happen. Beyond just protecting your passwords and all these things, there's the embodied data, I think, that's really important. And how you can, even your mugshot, there are data sets made of mugshots that train AI, and then there's an inherent bias in that. And I don't know, if you aren't somebody who has had a mugshot taken, you might not think that your face can be part of a computer vision training program. And that has huge implications going forward about who is seen as a criminal. And it's typically people of color, typically men often. And I just think it's fascinating. And then you have this whole idea of trying to refuse all of this in the Feminist Data Manifesto that's in that supplemental readings. The thing that I really love about it is they start everything with, "We refuse XYZ." And I think that's really important. And Mylkweed, everything that you're saying right now as things that we can do to protect our own privacy is kind of that act of refusing to
Totally
accept that these systems exist.
Right. It's I think that's the thing that's it's catalyzing. I really love that the Feminist Data Manifesto's idea of refusing. It's I think, easy, not just with regard to surveillance, but kind of so many things in the world right now. It's easy to just feel it's too big to defeat the kind of systems of oppression and various, other things, especially with Silicon Valley type tech companies, right? They feel like these huge things that we can't. I mean, how can I reclaim my data from something that's so large? But I totally agree that it just takes that sort of step of desiring refusal and then doing it in whatever ways are accessible to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think you could take that even further and think about, I guess, two separate sides of the coin. A, who has the right to privacy and who has the right to refuse.
Right.
And I guess those can be seen as one and the same. Because if you are refusing, you are asserting your right to privacy in this scenario.
What I got from that was that it's assert your right to privacy and do whatever you can. Even if it's small things, those will add up at some point and help you in one way or another. So
Right.
even if you can't, completely control your destiny by becoming assertive and realizing that your data is, being abused everywhere, to take the steps to try to hold back.
And
the
there's
flood.
definitely a lot of, it should be noted too, Molly, I think you brought up sort of what the idea of who has access to kind of privacy and restricting their own data. And I do think it's worth noting that for me personally, one of the best measures of if a tool like, for example, KeePass XC is a good tool for privacy is whether or not it's open source. And the good thing about open source technology is that it's pretty much always free by nature because it's open source. And so that is to say that I do think there's a lot of class implications of privacy. I think that wealthy people have more access to privacy, and obviously because they spend less time in public space, both digitally and physically. But I also think that I just want to say that there are a ton of free tools that can be helpful. Sometimes they can be a little cryptic, but yeah, I mean, free and open source software is the way to go. And the reason I say that too, just to clarify, is that when a piece of technology is closed source, meaning that nobody can see the source code, whether it's an app or a device or whatever, we don't really know what's happening with that data. But with free and open source technology, like I can't read the source code for KeyPass XC, but the fact is that somebody can who understands it, and they will absolutely speak up. Security researchers will absolutely speak up if there's problematic code in a device that purports to be about security or an application. So hopefully that makes sense.
You're trusting in the open source community to protect you in some way.
Right, absolutely. And I think a lot of people have fear in trusting the open source community, but for me personally, I would trust people who are interested in this research for their own interest rather than companies that are interested in selling my data.
Right. Trying to identify who has the motive to do what.
Right.
I don't know if I would trust an open source community necessarily, though. Go back to, law enforcement has always managed to infiltrate any kind of community that it wanted to infiltrate. So. I
think definitely rule number one with privacy is that, if you're saying something or doing something online, or actually in the meat space, honestly, there's really no way to assert that it's fully private. So just be careful what you say and do regardless. And that's not to take like a nihilistic approach that we shouldn't do any privacy stuff, but I think if we're being honest, it's true that there's potentially infiltrators and backdoors in 0 days in any piece of technology.
What are the best ways to educate public at large about these issues? Anybody can take this question. Okay.
I mean, I think the first piece of it has to be helping people knock down that, I guess, kind of like discomfort and fear around, wow, this is super high tech, like I can't understand this. Just thinking that this is so inscrutable and it's so complex and I'll never be able to get it. But like somebody out there understands, and you can understand that too. Like I feel like that's gotta be the first step.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree with you, Molly. I think that accessibility is always is like the most important thing with privacy because we feel disempowered by the lack of information. Yeah, I mean, I think, but I don't know how that like accessibility gets shared with people.
I mean, I think just through social, not necessarily pressure, but most security-related like messaging apps and stuff that I use have almost been at the request of like my peers who know more about me. And I thought that's like an effective way that I've imbibed that information. Is like, hey, can you message me on Signal? I'll be like, why should I message you on Signal? It's like, oh, because it's an encrypted platform, stuff like that.
Totally.
Just personally speaking, that's been effective for getting kind of information from me from other people.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I definitely in the past 2 years have been sort of undergoing like just serious privacy transformations in my personal life, and like it's at first was really awkward to request that people use specific technologies, but now I feel totally comfortable. I mean, I don't text via SMS ever anymore. Like I think in a year now I haven't used SMS pretty much at all. Basically, I only talk to people on the phone who are using Signal. And also, I do want to reiterate, though, that putting all your trust in one technology is probably never a good idea. But I totally agree, Patrick, that it's the smartest to to just kind of pressure the people around you, and then hopefully they pressure the people around them.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons that we decided to take more of an interest in data security and the issues surrounding it are that we've noticed this explosion of data used in nefarious ways from governments, with photo information technology, scanning, crowds, I wouldn't be surprised that in just about any demonstration that's happened in the last year or two, I wouldn't be surprised if someone said the FBI has names of 80% of the people that attended them.
Oh, I would say the last 5 years at least.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that they've been using really, really sophisticated video surveillance since Ferguson, really. So
The image you're projecting on the screen, this reminds me of this concept of we're entering into a world of deep fakes, and does anybody want to talk about that technology a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me personally, I think that's another thing that we just have to kind of like, I don't know, I'm trying to figure out how to word this. I'll say that for both privacy and in terms of determining what information is real and what's not, if you believe in that dichotomy, there is a set of rules and expectations that were kind of put in place 15 or maybe even 25 years ago with the popularization of the internet and digital technology that are just outdated. So, I mean, you couldn't believe a photograph 15 years ago, but you really can't believe a photograph now.
Well, even a video too, isn't that becoming more?
Totally.
Right. So, I mean, in the last, 4 years, it's been impossible to believe, the internet, period. I mean,
Definitely.
how do we fight this? Besides, what we're trying to do is expose it as much as possible. We're having a data war in some senses, and I don't know who the good guys are and who the bad guys are necessarily at all times.
Yeah, I'm probably not a great person to ask about the truth because I'm not sure that I always fully believe that anything is the truth, but
Yeah.
I do think it's an issue though in terms of like people just believe, like I think we're trained to just kind of believe images, and it's really not, it doesn't do us a service for sure. I mean, even an unaltered photograph, right? Like I'm a photographer. I choose where to point my camera. I compose that image, through the lens, or maybe I crop it afterwards. And so you only really get a partial truth of whatever scene it is. And I think that's just becoming amplified, right, by things like deepfakes.
Yeah, that makes me think about, I remember when I was middle school, high school, and starting to use the internet, and all of our computer class teachers would kind of vaguely teach us how to figure out if a source was credible or not. Just was it a journalist or was it a blog person, a blog writer? And was it credible? Could we use it in our papers? Things like that. Very basic fact checking kind of. Does anything like that exist? Any education initiatives exist for deep fakes and trying to figure out, is this a real photo? Is it not? Is there any education around that?
I don't know if there's education about it, but I do know that there are quite a few people who are working on technologies which can identify deepfakes. So I think while it is freaky to see them, I think that technology can be both the problem and the solution at the same time in this case. Like, one way that we can combat them is by sort of algorithmically identifying them. But I mean, that also runs into its own issues for sure.
There's while we're on the subject of data and photography, there's a lot of metadata in a photograph, in a digital photograph, that, you don't see but can be detected. At the deepfake level, you have to deal with the metadata too, or you're going to get caught.
Yeah, I think that's also true. We were talking about like protest privacy writing, kind of surveillance that happens of activists. I think people don't really realize that a lot of social media platforms do publish the EXIF data, which is where that's the metadata basically. So I would always recommend using specifically, I don't know about on iPhone because I don't use Apple products personally, but so I use an open source distribution that's it's based on Android called Calyx. And if you are using Calyx or a similar open source Android distribution that's Google free, which I would recommend, there's an app called Scrambled, which is probably honestly available for iOS as well, which will, you can have it either remove your EXIF data or just put in scrambled EXIF data in your photos so that all that metadata that has like revealing information about the device and location and whatever else is gone. So the tool is scrambled like an egg.
Yeah, that sounds like a good tool to have.
But if you don't want to do that, you can also just screenshot it, and then at the very least, the photo will have the metadata of the device you screenshotted it with, rather than the metadata of the camera, which could be kind of covering your tracks a little bit, although it's not foolproof.
Yeah, that's a little thing you can do to clean up your data.
Yeah, definitely.
As it goes out into the world.
I definitely think even short of asking people in photos, also like we were talking about earlier, blurring people in photos is a good option too if you don't know them or you don't know if they're okay with their face being photographed or whatever. Just blur them out.
Yeah, and always assume any photo you post on the internet could end up someday in used in some nefarious way.
Yeah, I mean, anything that you're putting on the internet is being scraped by, who knows how many people, and stored on some server. So, I mean, you could upload something to a website and then moments later delete it. And I think we do all know that, right? Like they say, whatever you post on the internet is there forever. But it's really true. It may not be publicly available, but it might go into Google's server and never come back out again, or go into the server of a company that's running a facial recognition program for law enforcement, hypothetically, but not actually hypothetically because that's happening.
Yeah, I read about an Israeli company that had gathered over 3 billion pictures or something.
Yes, I think it's there's multiple of them now too that are basically claiming to offer identification of anyone, pretty much, whether or not they have. Again, speaking to what Patrick was talking about earlier, whether or not they themselves have any social media presence, at the very least it would identify all other photos of them on the internet, which probably could have a lot of useful information gleaned.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty safe to assume that like Pfizer has a lot of Israeli data because that was part of the deal for Israel getting those doses. Which is a weird thing to think about, that a company can have all this extra data, which I don't know.
Right, that's totally one of the main things that kind of inspired the idea of privacy as mutual aid, is that really there's very little regulation of what data companies can have and utilize in what ways. The government of the US at least, and a lot of maybe other countries, I don't really know, but has some regulation, but companies pretty much can do whatever they want with your data as long as it's publicly available data. And really, unless you're using really private technology, if you have an internet service provider in your house, every website you've ever visited is available to them, and they sell it to data brokers who sell it to advertisers. If you use a phone that has Google or Apple operating system on it. They're exfiltrating all of that data out to advertisers also.
So if you weren't scared before you started watching us, be scared, be very scared, right? Anybody got any last words? Should we go around and give some final thoughts? I'll start with Molly.
Final thoughts. I mean, I think the moral of this whole talk is just being more mindful of how you yourself are acting on the internet for your own self, but also for those around you who might not have the ability to refuse, the privilege, I guess, to refuse that you might have. So I think that's important. Like, I can think of certain maybe situations that could happen. Like if someone's using your laptop and you only have Chrome, maybe install Safari or Firefox or something that's a little bit better so that they don't have to use Chrome. I don't know. This is definitely making me think about ways that I can be better at privacy, not just for myself, but for other folks. I guess those are my final thoughts. Just a jumble of not much.
How about you, Pat?
Final thoughts are just to be careful, stay safe.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I had a question for you that
Uh-huh.
I was curious about. In your profession as a t-shirt printer,
Mm-hmm.
do you ever encounter groups who you're making a t-shirt for them who don't want to be able you or anybody else to be able to trace back to who is the group?
Interesting, by way of like payment or something like that?
Yeah.
I don't think so in particular, but why do you ask?
I don't know, just wondering.
Yeah.
we might need some shirts.
Oh, okay.
No.
I mean, I'd be curious as to how, because yeah, financial transactions are totally a major part of data collection, and being a part of a business, that is something that there's many different times in which we're collecting information from people to move them on to the next step. So, for our tax purposes and stuff like that, but I would be...
Cash paying masked client.
Mm-hmm.
Have any of those?
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, there's some cash paying clients, and maybe they've given us some, they put out some noise as opposed to information or something. So it's totally possible, yeah, by still using cash
Yeah.
But that is an interesting aspect of it. I haven't thought about that much because I don't particularly anonymize buying things on the internet.
I just want to chime in real quick to say that one tool, I need to make a list of links so we can put it in the YouTube description or something, but one tool that you can use to do that you absolutely should not use to protect purchases from the eyes of the government, because it is absolutely not a good tool for that, but that you can use to generally protect purchases from other snoopers is privacy.com. So it'll generate Visa cards that are single use for you, basically Visa card numbers. You have to attach it to your bank account though, which is why I say that it shouldn't be used for anything that's like really very serious. But if you're buying something from a website you don't trust, or signing up for a subscription you don't actually want, use a privacy.com card.
So it will anonymize your credit card, and give you another credit
Yeah,
card?
basically you create an account with them, you link it to your bank account, and then essentially it creates Visa card numbers that it's like the equivalent of a VoIP phone number, but for a card. Although I will say that I think that websites, I use them pretty frequently, and I think that some websites, specifically websites that use Stripe, are starting to deny them because they've maybe been abused or something. So with all tools, don't abuse them too much.
My final thought is along the lines of internet literacy. When we talk about internet literacy, I think it has to include some aspect of what we're talking about today, for all ages. And lucky for us, there are people like Mylkweed doing what they do, willing to go to certain extremes to protect other people who may not have the means or the desire to do as much, right? And I think that it's kind of an important concept that people need to understand, that, you know, go as far as you can with what you know, I think, is kind of important.
Well, go as far as you can with what you know, and then don't be afraid to ask questions for what you don't know, too.
Right.
Right. I think my closing thought, sort of in response to that, is the internet is really, you know, sketchy for a lot of reasons, but also really great because there's pretty much an infinite amount of information about this stuff. So if something seems like an impenetrable topic that's too dense, or the vocabulary is like too cryptic, which a lot of this kind of privacy and tech related stuff is intentionally cryptic, look it up. Probably on Reddit you can find the answer. And you know, Reddit's maybe not always the best place for a lot of reasons, and there's a lot of like censorship that's gone on Reddit, but the Reddit privacy community, the subreddit privacy, is a really great place to start, just to look around and find out information. And I will say too, I think I have like a couple kind of axioms that are like, I think are important for anybody to think about in terms of privacy. And one of them is that if a service you're using is free, but it's not open source, you're paying for it with your data. So, you know, we're all accustomed to using services like Gmail or Instagram or Facebook or whatever. And I'm not saying don't use those services, but be aware that Gmail scans all of your emails and also does optical character recognition on any PDF file or image that you attach. And obviously all the data we give to any social media site is being sold and used and abused. So if it's free, you're paying for it with your data unless it's free and open source. And then the other thing that I wanted to say is that I think we got a little bit away from the topic of mutual aid, but the main thing that is kind of important in mutual aid as a whole, beyond privacy, at least if you follow Kropotkin's idea of mutual aid, is the idea of common struggle, right? Like we have to to reach any conclusion, we have to emerge from the basis that we're experiencing the same struggle. So all of us who are talking right now, and anybody really who exists in this society, is experiencing in one way or another the adverse effects of digital surveillance. And so that's basically just has to be the basis. Otherwise, I don't think we're going to get anywhere. So even if you don't think you are, there's definitely surveillance happening and adverse side effects happening to you.
Great. This concludes the live stream portion of our evening. Stay on though, you guys, for 1 second, but kill the live stream.